So in this session, we'll be talking about the standards and definitions, basically creating a song sheet for everyone to sing from. When we speak to people in conversation, speak to business organizations, business owners, management, that kind of thing, we hear some common phrases. Phrases like, we need to use the cloud, and we want to deploy a private cloud solution. And these are okay as conversation starters, but they really don't have much meaning. We've got to give them some context in order to understand what it is that they actually want to get. A statement like, I want a car, has as much meaning. We need to ask a whole bunch of other questions in order to be able to understand really what it is that the customer wants. Why do they want a car? What type of car do they want? How much do they want to pay for the car? Do they have a particular fixed budget in mind? How many people do they need to carry? Do we need a 7-seater? Do we need a 2-seater? How long do they need it for? This is a really good question when we're talking about cloud services especially. If we're looking at acquiring a car, is this a short-term hire or a long-term 5-year commitment? How fast does it need to go? Are we talking sports car? Are we talking about a utility vehicle? On or off-road? 4-wheel drive, 2-wheel drive? And what options would we like to have on that car? Climate control's got to be in there surely. When we're looking at cloud computing, the cloud statement, the same questions have to be asked. What sort of service are we looking at? What sort of usage of that service? 2 users, 200 users, 200,000 users? What budget are we working to? Is there a particular cost that we have to bear in mind when we're looking at solutions? And where does it need to be? Are there particular geographic limitations that we need to take into account? We're talking about private cloud, but in order to talk about private cloud, we have to first define cloud itself. And we need to avoid this cloud washing. Marketing people are very fond of new buzzwords, and they've been applying cloud to pretty much everything that they can nowadays. And everybody's guilty of it to a certain extent. But we really need to avoid doing that in full, proper business conversation because it dilutes the meaning and it causes confusion. The cloud definitions in terms of service are very clear. Infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and software as a service. IaaS, PaaS, and SaaS. So cloud computing has a specific definition. The NIST definition, which is the definition which has been put forward to ISO for adoption as an international standard, states, cloud computing is a model for enabling convenient, on-demand network access to a shared pool of configurable computing resources, e.g. networks, servers, storage, applications, and services, that can be rapidly provisioned and released with minimal management effort or service provider interaction. That's the definition of cloud. It's a concept which isn't totally new. We've been using online services for a number of years. We've been delivering software as a service for a number of years before it had that specific definition. Think about online email services, hosted exchange services and the like. But cloud brings together 3 very specific types of service delivery. The infrastructure as a service, the platform as a service, and the software as a service. But those 3 elements have one thing in common, and that's the way that the services are put together. Typically, we have a large x86-based infrastructure, the servers, the storage, and the networking. And that infrastructure is virtualized into smaller dynamic resources, and those resources are then consumed by individual customers across the internet. So this is the common framework that we have for cloud computing services. So cloud computing has some essential characteristics, without which it's simply not cloud computing. The first of which is resource pooling, the bringing together of the compute, the server, the storage, the networking resources. The second is measured service, how these services are pulled together. The third is broad network access. We're not talking about proprietary network access or proprietary communications. This is internet-based standards. The fourth is rapid elasticity. This is the ability to scale services out and back as required. And the final essential characteristics of cloud computing is the on-demand self-service nature. The ability for users to manage, control their own environment, either through a portal or through other management mechanisms. If any one of those essential characteristics is missing, it cannot be truly called a cloud service. If we look at the compute service models, if we compare the traditional on-premise service model where everything is owned and managed by the customer, and then let's look at the cloud compute service models. With infrastructure as a service, the virtualization layer, the computers, the networking, the data center are owned and managed by the service provider. The customer has no control over those aspects. From operating system upwards with infrastructure as a service, that's where the customer lives. That's their environment, that's what they own and manage. With platform, it's the application layer and maybe some of the middleware which is owned and managed by the customer. And with software as a service, they own none of it. They simply consume the service, they access the software online. So if we have a look at the definitions of these services, the formal definitions from NIST again. Infrastructure as a service, the capability provided to the consumer is to provision processing, storage, networks, and other fundamental computing resources where the consumer is able to deploy and run arbitrary software, which can include operating systems and applications. Within infrastructure as a service, typically the hardware is owned, maintained, and managed by the service provider. It's used as a commodity and billed on a per-use basis. And typical characteristics of infrastructure as a service: utility computing and a billing model based around that service. Automation of certain administrative tasks, server creation, server removal, backups, that kind of thing. And dynamic scaling both up and down of that service resource. Adding more VMs on demand, removing VMs on demand, or even automating that process. If we look at platform as a service, the definition reads this: the capability provided to the customer is to deploy onto the cloud infrastructure consumer-created or acquired applications, created using programming languages and tools supported by the provider. The consumer does not manage or control the underlying cloud infrastructure, including the network servers, operating systems, or storage, but has control over the deployed applications. There is an abstraction away from operating system, from servers, from hardware. The platform is delivered as a service itself. And the typical characteristics of a platform as a service is the environments are represented as single entities. We talk about database services rather than database servers. And finally, with software as a service, the capability provided to the consumer is to use the provider's application running on a cloud infrastructure. The applications are accessible from various client devices through a thin client interface, such as a web browser. With this, the customer controls and manages none of the underlying stack. They simply consume the service, they access the application. And some typical characteristics of that: online access to commercial applications, centralized administration of permissions and access types, single point upgrades and updates. The upgrades happen centrally and everybody gets those updates. And potentially integration with other online services, creating platform suites. And one of the characteristics that we really want to see in software as a service offerings is the subscription, per user, per month. So we've talked about the service models. Let's now look at the deployment models. And a lot of the confusion comes when these two aspects are misaligned. People talk about private cloud or software as a service, or online services and public cloud, and they use them interchangeably, and they really shouldn't, because they're separately defined. So we have four according to NIST: the private cloud, the community cloud, the public cloud, and the hybrid cloud. The private cloud is a cloud infrastructure operated solely for one organization. That's what makes it private. It may be managed by the organization or a third party, and may exist on or off premise. There is no necessity for ownership of the infrastructure by the customer. The infrastructure is operated solely for that customer. That's what makes it a private cloud. The community cloud is a cloud infrastructure shared by several organizations. This may be on a multi-tenant basis, or maybe simply as multiple instances. But those organizations have shared concerns, i.e. their mission, their security requirements, compliance, that kind of thing. And it makes sense for those organizations to actually work together and use a community cloud. The public cloud is the one we're most familiar with. In here we're talking about Microsoft Azure or BPOS or Amazon's EC2 product, that kind of environment. With the hybrid cloud, we're talking about the composition of two or more separate cloud entities, be they public and private, or private and community, or private and public. So we're bringing these together in a hybrid way to leverage the best functionality of both sides. But what we're talking about with this workshop is private cloud. And again, we must emphasize private cloud is a cloud infrastructure operated solely for one organization. It doesn't have to be operated by that organization or managed by that organization. It may be managed by a third party on their behalf.